Okay, I think we're online. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Fedinger, for agreeing to have this interview with me. My name is Zhongyu Luo, or my English name is Louis Luo, and I'm the president of Basuria Association, and a non-profit organization dedicated to the independence of Basuria and the preservation of Basurian identity. Thank you very much. Mr. Fedinger is one of the earliest Europeans that took interest in our movement and took interest in the disintegration of China. And we just want to have a little conversation with Mr. Fedinger today. But could you just do a little bit of introduction of yourself to our audience? Thank you very much.
My name is Günther Fedinger from Austria. I'm Austrian economist, and I'm active in Southeastern Europe and in European politics since 30 years, basically, since my student times. And I'm advocating NATO and EU enlargement, the victory of Ukraine, and also the dismantlement of Russia. That's my most important priority. We have had these big conferences in the European Parliament in Washington now about a future for the post-Russian space. And as China is now also an ally of Russia, I met several representatives of independence movements of various Chinese states in Washington, and I'm supporting them as well because I protest in that way also against this terrible support which China is giving for the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine and all of us actually, because it's also a food war, it's an energy war, and they are really want to change the world order. Right. Which I think, yes, let's change the world order, but let's change the Chinese state and the Russian state, because they're ultimately a very big mistake in history. The truth of the matter is, it was the biggest tragedy of the world that the Bolshevik have won the Russian Revolution in 1917 and 18. It was a coup d'etat. And after this tragic Second World War, Stalin has supported the communists to win the Chinese Civil War. And that's the reason why there is all this terrible situation in China today. So their history is very much connected. And also our values, I think, oblige us to give a loud voice to the independence movements of the Russian people and also of the people who have the unfortunate situation to live in the current communist China. And it's a natural way forward, I think, and that freedom always wins. And we have now liberated, and we were very lucky with that in the last 32 years. So many new countries have developed out of the communism, like Poland, like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, so many of them, Slovenia, Croatia. And so now with this war of aggression, I've started these activities as well to support my friends from the Free Nations Forum. And that's my activity. Now we have been in contact on Twitter, and I'm very happy to answer all the questions about me and about the future of China and about the future of, I always call it ex-Russia, ex-China, and ex-Iran, because they're all supporting themselves and they're supporting the Russian war effort. And I think they have lost all legitimacy to legitimately dominate the people who don't want to live in their countries, like the Basurians. And I think freedom for Basuria is the right policy for the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. But first, I would like to ask a little bit of a personal question, if you don't mind. That is, what is the first thing that got you interested in politics at the first place? Because many of our supporters are, they're hesitating. Do I want to step up and participate in political activism? So, what makes your what makes you to step into the politics or become interested in politics in the first place?
I'm now 55, and when I was a young student in the school in my hometown in Austria, in Linz, it was that we were very much surrounded by very complicated and dangerous countries.
Yes.
The Soviet Union had their tanks in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary. This was just 30 kilometers off the border of Austria. And in the south, it was the war in Yugoslavia in the 90s, the breakup. And so we are now we are a very rich country, Austria, but at that time, we are, of course, we are state neutral, but we were in a very complicated situation. And I was very worried about the situation because the tanks very close, and we had to be very careful Austrian politics was very careful not to say anything the
Yes.
the Soviet embassy didn't want to hear, because the Austrian politicians, and I know many of them, they always tell me the moment they said something, whatever, they did something, they even fought something, or they whispered something, the Soviet ambassador called them and said, we don't like that. And it was like this. And so I have decided to be active in politics, because also it was when I was a student then in the 90s, it was a wonderful time, because I could, first time in 1990, I was actually going still to the Soviet Union that time with the train. It was really wonderful experience. And I saw how different lifestyle is already, because Soviet Union in 99 was very, very poor.
Right.
It was a complete disaster. And now they tell that the 90s were a disaster. That's the Putin narrative. The 90s. No, the 80s were a disaster. Why? Because they attacked Afghanistan and they spent all the money there. And the Muslim world was very angry on them. And they flooded the world with oil, with cheap oil. And so the Soviet Union went bankrupt.
Yeah.
And that was one of the key reasons, also the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union. And I saw how poor they were. And then all they had to withdraw the troops, and all the countries from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and they all got free, Romania, and it was 100 million people free suddenly at my doorsteps. And so I was very motivated to travel to all the countries to support the EU and NATO integration. And mostly it was very successful, and I'm very happy. We are now a much bigger, stronger nation out of the disasters of Eastern European communist domination. Now all these countries are free, and that's a wonderful role model also for Dagestan, for Basuria, for Siberia, and also for East Turkestan, and for Tibet, because it was possible to overcome communism, and it will be possible again to overcome also this terror regime of Russia and also the Communist Chinese Party. They have aligned themselves with a failing regime. That was their tragic mistake. And they will fall together with the Chinese regime and the Russian regime.
Thank you very much. I grew up under Chinese occupation. I was born in the early 1990s. I was born in 92. So it was 3 years after Tiananmen Square, but still that event, the bloody event, is still like very present in China in when I was growing up in 1990s and early 2000s. So, but I was always curious about, like, so say you are an Austrian, and how about the Europeans, and especially Western Europeans connotation or their concept? What is their understanding of communism at the time around early 1990s?
Yeah, that's very important. You speak about the Tiananmen massacre, because I was also at the protests in Vienna. I remember very well. It was in June '89, and I personally I protested. We had this headband, for the Chinese to protest against this terrible massacre. And it was really one of the most outrageous things to be done. And it will always stain the history of Chinese communism, that they have cracked down on innocent students in this very horrible fashion. But on the other hand, the things are always connected, because this terrible thing which the Chinese communists have done has led for us Europeans to one effect, that some of the Eastern European communist leaders, like in Eastern Germany, Poland, and in Czechoslovakia, they would have been maybe ready to use the violence as well. And they were thinking about, should we go to the Chinese way? Should we do a Tiananmen massacre as well in Berlin or in Dresden or in Prague? And they decided against it, mainly because they saw how terrible it is. So in a way, this sacrifice of the students of the 4th of June has led to the Eastern European freedom. I think it's connected in many ways. And we are all very much connected in our history, because let's never forget that the European Union is very much a product of the fall of China and of the Korean War, because we often forget it. Because in Europe, all our states, we were hating each other, the Germans, the French, the Spanish, we still have a lot of antagonism because of the Second World War, because of history. And it would have been impossible to unite if not the Stalin strategy was in 47, 49 to take over China, which mostly, with the exemption of Taiwan and Hong Kong, he managed. And then he had this idea to allow the North Korean dictator to push the Americans out of South Korea. And that was the shock of the world. And even then, it took some time, but we had then the possibility and the unity to build the European Union as a result of the threat of Stalin's aggression. And we could push him back in South Korea, and it's still to this moment free. And one day it will be united as well, like Germany, I'm confident, after the fall of the Chinese communists, which basically are the lifeline of the North Koreans. But then there will be unity of Korea again, I'm confident. And that will be a very good scenario. And then obviously it's, when you ask me about the nature of communism, obviously, you know, we know very well what communism is, because half of Europe was dominated, and we know how terrible it is. Nobody has to explain it to us. Some younger generation maybe have forgotten it, and they have some illusions like, oh, it's so fancy when we share everything and we share. But you know, you're not the decider in communism. It's a very few little elite of princes who are basically the sons of communist leaders, and they decide who shares what with whom. It's not such a free for all system. No, it's an absolute disaster, and it always leads with maximum violence. And I have been in most communist countries. I have also been to China twice, 3 times actually. I have been to all Eastern European countries, and I've been to Russia many times, 7 times, not since Putin was there, but in the 90s. So I know exactly the terrible results of communism on the people, on the mentality, on the destruction of the human nature, on the nature itself. We are still facing a lot of disasters in Eastern Europe because of communist disaster on the people, against the nature. And it's a horrendous system. And I can just pray for the freedom of the Chinese.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important to remind, especially the younger generation today, that communism wasn't a distant past. Even though Russia and China now, they try to distance themselves ideologically from communism, but many of their mechanisms of ruling totalitarianism, their mindset is pretty much still in that mindset of a few elite controlling a large population. But thank you very much.
Absolutely, and also the system of the secret police.
Right, exactly, yes.
The Chinese communists might have now a very successful economic system. They copied the mechanisms of the West in that one, but still you have a very powerful secret police, and they are dominating the state, and they are dominating the political scene. And that's, of course, a disaster, a legacy of the communist times.
Yes, thank you. So I know you've been a vocal supporter of a larger NATO and European role, of the role of EU in the Russian-Ukrainian war and in basically the world affairs. So can you elaborate on that? Why do you think NATO and the European Union should play a larger role, not only in Europe, but in just the world in general?
Yeah, NATO is a defensive alliance. So we don't attack anybody. We are not aggressive, but we are a voluntary association of countries who want to be free and want to stay free. And so I think it's very important to have stability in security, because the rejection of Ukraine from NATO in 2008, 15 years ago, had led to constant war now with Russia, basically in Georgia, and in Ukraine we have constant war now 15 years in different stages. Now the complete escalations in 2022. But what we need is clarity, because clear borders, clear defense arrangements, and they are based on deterrence, and they keep the peace. So I'm a very strong believer in nuclear deterrence, in nuclear umbrellas, in NATO defense. And they sound, of course, it's a bit, wow, nuclear and defense, but you need to do that, because there was no moment where the Soviet Union really attacked NATO during the Cold War, and also Putin is not attacking NATO. And if we had allowed Ukraine in NATO in 2008, where Putin was much weaker already then, internally, politically, fiscally, militarily, we would have had no problem at all and no war. And now, unfortunately, it's always this policy to make some business with Russia, and Russia has a lot of billions to invest in the West, of course, and then, of course, the Russian energy weapon. And so it's always easier to sacrifice Ukraine. But as we have seen, it's working absolutely in a disastrous way. The cost of this war is now huge, and in human and in fiscal terms. and we are all paying for that. And it would be much better to have a good deterrence system. Also for the EU, that's very important. The European Union is a very, very peaceful and positive contribution to give stability to smaller states. It's also something in a longer vision, it can be discussed for the successor states of China and to also form in some kind of economic cooperation like the Association for Southeast Asian States. In the beginning, maybe that's not what the new states who emerge from China want, but I think regional economic integration gives a stable framework for politics and for economics and for freedom. And we are really a success story in terms of unity. It's complicated from time to time, but in terms of prosperity, it's really very successful. And this is what I recommend also for other parts of the world.
All right, thank you. I know you emphasize the role of deterrence, especially military and nuclear deterrence in the presence of peace, so you can prevent future wars. And the United States is constantly using deterrence in the Taiwan-China relations. The United States was trying to use military deterrence to stop China from a costly war. But recently we see that France and Germany had second thought on it. They seem to take a softer role. They seem to have a softer tone with China. They don't want to provoke China too much. And so do you think Europe as a whole or Europe in general is capable of deterring China from a war, from an invasion of Taiwan, or do you think it's still something that we need to work on?
We need to work on that, yeah, because absolutely Taiwan must be defended, and Taiwan is under the American security umbrella. And we should join that, absolutely, yeah. Because there is no way, of course, the truth is also that Germany and France have very little military assets they could send, because France has, to my best knowledge, one airport carrier, and UK too, and ultimately to project power into the Taiwanese-Chinese straits, you need a lot of aircraft carriers and also the air wings and the air force, and that we simply don't have. And we need that also to defend ourselves now, as we see, and we need to support Ukraine. So we are dependent, and we are also allied to the United States of America, and we should be in full solidarity with them on the China policy. Obviously, what I also, we have to be careful here, because in America, there is a little bit of anti-Asian xenophobic feeling, yeah, and we should not fall into that trap as well, yeah, because with all the successor states and of China, we will have absolutely good relation, and we will have to accept the fact that as a result of the breakup of China, it might be a bit chaotic in the beginning, but the Chinese people and the Chinese states will be similar successful like Taiwan is today. And Taiwan is already more successful than most European states. Because the Chinese people, and I call it now the Chinese citizens, the Basurians and the East Turkeys and everybody who lives in China, it's very capable people. It's very, very intelligent and very productive and very hardworking. And you see, imagine just the Taiwanese, how much more successful they are than the Chinese communist people. Why? Because the Chinese communists live under the wrong system and the Taiwanese live under freedom. And they are so successful. Imagine if all the 1.3 billion people who have the unfortune to be governed by communist China and Beijing would be free. You would be the richest of the whole world. And yeah, we would be a little bit jealous maybe then. But in fact, the wealth of the Chinese has been always very strong, and you will be again. And we will work very closely together very successfully. I'm confident on that one. But let me make it very clear that even when we are trying like sneaky snakes, some Europeans, to make a little bit of business with Russia, it failed. Yeah. And now we are trying sneaky snakes like with business with China because we need, yeah. And of course, we have to move a bit careful, because the difference is also that the Russians have started the war. The Chinese have just been allied. Yeah. So the Chinese have not been aggressively outside of their borders since 79. Yeah. So it's a big difference here. So I'm very much now the first priority for me is the breakup of Russia as a hostile and terrorist state.
Sure.
And with the Chinese, we have to start, I think, a different form of political dialogue, where I say, of course, it's a strong thing to support the independence of Basuria, but it's a political process, where maybe also China will develop in some kind of federation. It's also possible, but with a strong independent federation of Basuria, Tibet, that are open questions, to be clear, because as long as China is not really invading anybody, like, for example, Taiwan, and then the offensive breakup option is a little bit on the back burner. Because, to be honest, when they would go and attack Taiwan, I would very clearly, immediately say that's the end of China, and they have to be dismantled, like Russia will be dismantled now. And you will see, some of your viewers might not believe it, but next year, Russia will be crumbling already, and the Chinese authorities should be very careful, not to step their head out of their borders, but also very careful not to be committing human rights abuses inside China, because I warn them, when they step out of the line of the world community, there will be consequences they can see in the next years in the north of the border, where one country by the next of the ex-Russian Federation will become independent. And they are very well advised to be very careful, because this can be very likely also the scenario for China.
All right, thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned about some of the misinterpretations and misunderstandings of the United States on Asian countries, on East Asian countries. So do you think are there some of the most common misconceptions of Russia and of China in Europe right now that you want to correct, or you want to correct people about?
No, Russia has really committed clearly genocide in Ukraine now, and actually also the way the Russians are treating their own people, because who they send to the war? It's the people from Buryatia, it's basically Mongol people. They send the Turkic people, the people who are of older minorities, religious, ethnically. So be very clear that it could also happen in China. If it goes against Taiwan, it will be older minorities sent to die. So this is really outrageous. So I want to make also a positive case, because especially to the people of China, it's 1.3 and 4 million people. We want to be very friendly with the successor states of China, with Basuria especially. I recommend you to form independence movements and exile governments like Tibet has, or like East Turkestan. Basuria must be more famous, because I'm not a visionary to say what is the future of China. It will be breaking up, or will it be a federation? But I'm totally sure, and I'm absolutely 100% sure, that freedom is very strong, and with the help of technology, with the help of the knowledge of the future, then the people of Basurian descent will form stronger identity inside China or as their own independent nation. And that we must also learn the world that there is something like Basuria.
Yes.
You have to be famous. You have to be minimum as famous as Tibet, but also form a process similar like we have now in the ex-Russian forum, because I was meeting in Washington now representative from Buryatia, from Dagestan, from Kalmykia, from Siberia, from all these really wonderful future successor states. And they have agreed internally on the border what will be the new republics. They are starting the process of exile governments, and that's very good. And so it's very important also in the case of China, and that you, together with the Shanghai independence movement, with the East Turkestan, with the Inner Mongolia independence movement, with Tibet, that you are much more present on YouTube, on Twitter, everywhere, to tell the world that you have this case for independence, that you are mistreated in China today, and that there is serious human rights abuses today, and to prepare the case for independence, or maybe for a federal China built after the European Union. That's something to be discussed in the future. but that there is something like basuria. We need to explain and to sell to the world.
Right.
And we in Europe, we want to have very friendly and positive relations with Basuria and with all the independence movements of China. And that's, I think, the main message, that you need to organize, prepare, and that we need to work together. And the optimistic message as well from the success of the anti-communist liberation movement of the last 30 years in Europe,
Right.
to learn from them and to copy them, and also to build a much better and stronger world in the next 30 years, where we overcome this tragic legacy of the Chinese Civil War and of communists unfortunately winning in that terrible. Basically, let's always remember, it was Stalin who gave all the resources, politically,
Right.
militarily, financially, to Mao Zedong. Otherwise, he could not have won that civil war, and he would have never basically been able to dominate China for so long. His legacy is still strong, and so many tens of millions of people died during communist China, and still today the situation is much worse than it could be. And we have to defend Taiwan 100%. And also the Europeans will, in case of war, be sure about it. Similar like Ukraine, we will take that very seriously. We will move all our fiscal technology and financial muscle behind Taiwan after initial shock phase, where the Americans are the first one to really be there on the spot. But we will do all our political, financial technology answer as well if there would be war in the Taiwan Strait. But I call on the authorities of China not to do that, obviously, because the answer will be complete dismantlement and the complete defeat of China, as they can see now, the complete defeat of Russia to come.
All right, thank you very much. And I think this interview will just make Basuria a little more famous than it was before. Let's switch the topic to the
Yes.
Russian-Ukrainian war. What do you think, to your knowledge, what do you think is the more specific role of China during the war? What do you think is China is really helping Russia about? What is China doing there?
No, there is, of course, politically, it's very important. Yeah, you know, there was the meeting where Putin supposedly told Xi, the chairman, that he will do that at the Olympic Games, and then he did the invasion. So China could have stopped it from the beginning by saying, no, no, don't do that, because it's absolutely crazy. But Mr. Xi seemingly has at least nodded and positively. I don't know to which extent he knew, but I think it was a completely crazy thing to do from the Chinese side, because the Chinese, let's never forget why I am the Chinese state rich, because in 1978, the Americans have decided to make a secret deal with the Chinese to bring them against the Soviet Union in the position, and they gave them the most favored nation status. And then the reason why the Chinese state has now decently developed in the last 25 years is, of course, you know, the hard work of the Chinese and the exploitation of many Chinese workers and all the other things which are happening, unfortunately, slave labor. But very much is the responsibility of the United States and the European Union to give you the WTO membership and to grant you access to our markets. Yeah? So Chinese would be that poor country without the market access towards Europe and towards the United States of America. We made you rich. Of course, you worked for it. And you are now, also China is now a relatively rich country, mostly, with many issues which we discussed already. But then in that case, when you're rich because of us and not because of Russia, then basically you have green lighted, or not I say you, the Chinese leadership, the communists in Beijing, they have green lighted the war. And without that, it wouldn't have happened. So China has very much a responsibility morally, politically, and then also in the technology transfer, and in also giving concrete things. China has not given, to the best knowledge, and not given what I have here, not given military equipment, but they have given dual-use equipment, masses of dual-use equipment, flak jackets, army vests, military grade material, and so on and so on. There was massive transfer during the 1.5 years of war of Russia, and I think not that also in the level of technology that the Russians couldn't have sustained that war effort without the support of partly Iran, but mostly China. And that's very wrong. And the appeals from China and for peace were always half-hearted. Because let's not forget, the Chinese communists are the very first one in the global arena always to say non-intervention in the internal affairs, the sovereignty of people, the UN should not intervene, the US should not intervene. That's the communist blah, blah, blah all the time.
Yeah.
And they have, for example, not recognized Kosovo. My dear Kosovo, I'm working on that issue as well because of that. And that's exactly their policy. But when Russia invades Ukraine, the Chinese are silent. And you see how it is actually. That's the thing. Technology transfer, energy purchases, secret military supplies, I suppose so, at least in technology area where they need it, and then also other technology transfers, whatever, maybe money parked from the Russian central banks in Chinese asset, and all this political BRICS fraternity and the Shanghai Cooperation Council. So China is pretty much co-responsible for this war, and they have not done enough to distance themselves and not done enough to stop it. And that is why I started also to include the Chinese independence movement in my campaign. And I think they should also, I think the Chinese authorities should be very carefully watch what is happening now, because Russia is completely losing this war. And you will see in the coming weeks, there will be a very big success of the counteroffensive. Then everybody will be surprised. And I'm looking very much in the face of Mr. Chairman Xi, when he will see when Mr. Putin wants asylum to go into Beijing, will they give it to him? How good is the great friendship between Russia and China then, when Putin is basically on the run? I wonder if the Chinese would be so happy to host him in Beijing. That is another issue. But, you know, it was completely, if you're really a friendly person to somebody, like you're a friend, then you tell him honestly not to do crazy things. And it was very clear that the complete full-scale invasion of Russia of Ukraine, by Russia of Ukraine, was a completely crazy thing. Militarily, it's impossible to win because it's simply too much land, too much distance, and too little capacity of Russia, because Russia is not the Soviet Union, and even the Soviet Union couldn't really defeat Afghanistan. And the idea to conquer a whole country in today's technology possibilities is completely outrageous. So if Mr. Xi would have been a real friend of Putin, he told him, don't do it. You can run Russia for another 20 years if you don't do it. And that's a possibility, actually. Mr. Putin has already the presidency until 36. Yeah, he would have easily been the president. And now, 12 years before, in 24, he will not win this election. And if he wins, there will be a revolution in Russia. And that is basically the moment as well where the system in China might be shaking. So Mr. Xi made the mistake of his life to greenlight this invasion, and he will come to regret it next year, you will see. I'm not sure that China will break up next year. That's a bigger thing to make. You know, it's a really big and more successful state. Because never forget also the difference is that the Russians, they have only a petrol oil boom. They are some rich cities. But China really seriously developed the last 22 years since we allowed China in the WTO. And it's now a decently developed country. So if the Chinese communists lose the power in China, then it's only the responsibility of Chairman Xi, because he has made this tragic mistake of greenlighting that Russian invasion in Ukraine. Because otherwise, the Chinese would, with more likelihood, be communist for another 20, 30, 50 years. Yeah? But now also that question is on the table. And I really recommend very much to the Chinese communists, if they listen, and the Secret Service probably will watch this. Yeah, if you're smart, you withdraw the support from Russia, because then you will basically be able to somehow save your system for another decade to come. But if the Russian system falls, the world will very much watch China, and then everybody says, oh, if Russia falls, why not China falling as well? And that will be, a lot of people will think like that in China itself, because the Chinese communists, they killed a lot of people, and they are the fathers and children of many people. Many people in China have lost people in the Cultural Revolution, have lost family. They couldn't get children because of the one China policy. They are from minorities which were suppressed and went to prison. And I think every single family in China, yeah, it's my guess, I don't know every single family, obviously it's many, but I think every single family, if they look back in the living room where nobody listens, they have a big grudge against the Chinese communist system, because they lost their father, they lost their uncle, they lost opportunities. They understand very well they could be much richer like the Taiwanese if there would be normal democratic market development. And if they think in the night, they will not tell it, not even to their wives or children, but if they think the moment of freedom opportunity comes, a lot of people in China will stand up for freedom and will prefer freedom to communism, because they know exactly what kind of crimes they have been through, and they know exactly what is the limitation for their potential, and that's the communist regime. And the moment and they feel that there is a realistic opening to get rid of this Chinese bureaucrats and communists, then they will, I think so, they will rise.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I'm confident on that.
Yep. Although I don't know the personal relationship between Xi and Putin. I don't think Xi considered Putin a real friend. I think he was trying to use Russia's invasion of Ukraine as I guess as a decoy, as just to draw the attention of the West from his secret, not so secret plan of the invasion of Taiwan. But I think just as you said, Russia's successful invasion of Ukraine is not militarily possible. I think same thing goes with China's invasion of Taiwan, because Taiwan is an island. You don't even have land access. You have to conduct a very difficult warfare, both on air and at sea. But that said, why do you think? I'm sure Putin and Xi, they're not stupid. I think they really understand the risks of starting a war like this. But why do you think they're still? I mean, for Putin, he already conducted war, but for Xi, he is seriously considering the invasion of Taiwan. Why do you think they would consider such a risky move?
There's many reasons for that. Yeah.
Okay.
But one reason why they started in Russia, it's Ukraine. It's about, and maybe it's also true for Xi, it's the lifetime cycles of dictators.
Okay.
Dictators have a certain lifetime cycles. Yeah.
Okay.
And when they're reaching the year 70, they think about their role in history.
Okay.
It's not about, and they see, when they have absolute power for a decade, they always want to have more and the next big thing. Yeah. Okay. And then they think that they are unstoppable because they are basically at home unstoppable. The position of Xi and Putin at home is unstoppable.
Right.
And then they basically think that this is absolutely the way they can continue forever. And then they think, what's next? Oh, somebody, I have to finish the house because my successors are not so successful and they are weak. And I'm the strong man. I can finish Ukraine. I can finish Taiwan. I must do that. That's my historic duty. When I meet then the Mao in the chairman in the sky, I will meet him and I will tell him I finished the job. Yeah, and so on and so on. This kind of craziness is one reason. But it's also that they are communists in their mind. They are trained communists. Yeah. Okay. And let's never forget, trained communists believe in this communist crazy ideology. Yeah? And they always believe that the West is inherently weak. Yeah? They believe in our weakness, because when you read these books of Marx and Lenin's, and they always think the economic system of freedom is unstable because it doesn't have the state guidance, and it will always fall, and there will be economic crisis, and that's the moment where they can strike. So, for example, the global crisis of 1929 was already for the communists, then exactly Stalin started with the second-year plan and all this kind of industrialization, because he thought that Marx is a kind of visionary who sees the future. The crisis comes. That means that is the moment when they have to strike to prepare the war, because the final fall of capitalism will come and communism will win, and all this thinking. So the great financial crisis of 2008 has led Putin to think now the West is finished. It's basically tumbling back and finished. And then we have to strike in Georgia, in Ukraine, because they are anyhow too weak. And I think especially the moment of this virus, of the coronavirus, has led Putin to the thinking, now the West, they had a great financial crisis, they have a pandemic, They are morally bankrupt because they don't understand freedom is a kind of value. They think we are like gay, everybody, we are like crazy, we don't work, and we are totally fools, yeah. And we just love men, and and dogs, and when you go on Twitter, you see all these things. So they believe their own persiflage of the West, yeah?
Yes.
Because they watch on Twitter or on YouTube, they are all crazy, and they don't understand that we are tens and hundreds of millions of hardworking, intelligent people working on freedom. And that means that we really think and do and try and adopt to the situation. Of course, the great financial crisis was difficult. Of course, the corona was difficult, but we managed. Because why? Because we have freedom and we have institutions, and we somehow, shock, wow, what we do. Then we think, we innovate, we work, we adopt, and we win. And we are flexible, and we cannot be beaten because we have this flexible system. Even when you have one defeat somewhere, you work on the other and you win. And that's much different to the Chinese system and to the Russian system. And then Mr. Putin specifically, he had this idea that Mr. Biden is a very weak guy and very old and kind of crazy and sleepy Joe. He's watching too much Fox TV. That's the problem, yeah. And he believed probably the Trump propaganda. But Mr. Biden is a very experienced man. He was a Cold Warrior in the Senate for many decades. He really knows, and he is the ultimate American establishment. And Mr. Putin had made the big mistake of underestimating this American establishment figure. And so he thought he can push him over. He has a very weak idea of the Europeans. He thought he can buy them all and they will do nothing. And so the reality is much different. When the going gets tough, we also rise to the challenge. And so we will defeat him, and he will be over very soon. You will be surprised. And many of the Chinese, because they are wrong informed from the state media, they will be surprised. And many Russians will be surprised that they were defeated. But it's inevitable because we are economically much more advanced, technology much more advanced, and our willpower is rising with our necessities, and our fiscal power is almost unlimited. And Putin was delusionary, believing his own wishful thinking and thinking that he has to put the stamp on history. And he will be history very soon due to that.
Thank you. I think that's a very inspiring, actually a very inspiring point. I think similar things goes in the head of Xi as well. He's also thinking, and you can see that through Chinese state media, that they are portraying the decline of the West. Especially, I think they like the phrase very much. I think the West is like declining. They think the West is in a chaotic state, and especially I think especially in 2024, where there will be especially the election coming in the United States and in Taiwan at the same time. So many people suspect that might be the time for Xi to strike. We don't know, but I think that similar mindset is going in Xi's head as well. He wants to make his name in history books. He will, I think. But and also they tend to view the West as declining. I think that's the gravest mistake that I think that they will ever make. So I just have one last question. I understand that European countries doesn't necessarily have that much of an influence in Asia, in East Asia especially. But do you think, especially with China's aggressive stance, India and Japan will step up as the power to counter China, or do you think, or you are more skeptical to their role?
No, I'm actually positive to the role of India. But it's a democracy. It doesn't have any ambitions for territorial conquest or for dominating anybody else. It's not happening. But I think they will just economically catch up over time now, and they are already very important and very successful. And they are opening up. They were also, never forget, India was a semi-socialist system for most of the Cold War since the creation. This was not a communist system, but like a Yugoslavian socialist system. And this was, of course, a disaster for the people, and it was not working. And now they are gradually, in the last 15 years, they are gradually opening up, and it lifts a lot of people towards middle class, and they have also very successful IT, innovation, manufacturing. So things are moving in India. Japan is anyhow very successful and active, and it will be staying like this, because all these decline fantasies are just fantasies. You know, I can just share with you, in Austria and Germany, we had this very evil dictator in the Second World War. Yeah. It was called, you know, Hitler. Yeah. And he was having the same ideology. The West is declining. The Americans are weak. They are all like blah, 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 blah. And this kind, and we are, it's called, and even Kaiser Wilhelm at the same phase, you know, the fantasy is always called, we need a place in the sun. The Americans are rich, or then now the West is rich, and we are somehow discriminated by them. It's not like this, yeah. It's just, you know, that the Chinese, and I say you, the Chinese and the Russians, they have a very bad system of self-organization in terms of political system, which is holding them back. It's not our system which is holding anybody back. We are not in the time of the 19th century, suppression, colonialism, imperialism. We are now in a free world, and it's open for all, and it's open as well for the nations which will emerge very soon out of Russia. But actually, we have opened our world institution to the Chinese communists, actually, just as a reminder, in WTO. You have been, the Chinese country, the Communist Party there, has been integrated and has been very successful because of adopting our standards and being allowed to be part of the free world. Yeah, the whole success of the last 30 years is because of that. Yeah, and this ungratefulness and this kind of reproachfulness that we are like, oh, the world is biased. No. You choose to come and you choose to play our game, and you have been very successful as a Chinese communist country. Even when politically, the reason why you're not as successful as us is because you politically suppress the people and you commit a lot of human rights abuses. So that must be ended, and then there's a bright future ahead for the free people of China.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Fedinger. Thank you very much for your time on your busy person.
Freedom for Basuria.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was going to say that, but yes, thank you very much. You're a very busy person. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can get in touch later. Okay.
Very good. You are very welcome.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.